Good morning and welcome to our large event planning workshop. This workshop is a partnership with the Northwest Missouri State University and the Northwest Missouri Regional Council of Governments. Funding through this, a grant was actually makes this workshop possible through the Economic Development Administration, U.S. Department of Commerce, CARES Recovery Act grant. We are asking everyone to stay muted during the presentation. If you have questions, please type in the chat. We will unmute everyone when the presentation ends. Attendees can communicate without interrupting our speaker by clicking on the icons yes, no, slow down, speed up. These icons are found in the reactions menu in the toolbar, and when selected, they display on the participant's video and in the participants list until they are dismissed. I'd like to welcome and thank for his partnership in this grant, John Carr. John Carr serves as the Program Coordinator and Instructor for the Emergency and Disaster Management Program at Northwest Missouri State University. In addition to teaching courses, Carr serves as Exercise Director for Missouri Hope, the largest full-scale disaster training exercise in the region. The exercise brings together students, faculty, and partner agencies from throughout the country, allowing Northwest students firsthand experience in disaster response operations. Outside of Northwest, Carr serves as the Executive Director for the Consortium for Humanitarian Service and Education, a nonprofit focused on promoting full immersion, full behavioral simulation exercises to college students in the field of emergency management, nursing, homeland security, and humanitarian relief. Carr also serves his community through his work with the Boy Scouts of America, America Red Cross, and support of emergency management initiatives in Northwest Missouri. John Carr has a master's degree in emergency management from North Dakota State University, a bachelor's degree in psychology from Northwest Missouri State University, and is currently pursuing his doctoral degree from Jackson State University in Jacksonville, Alabama. His research interests include citizen engagement in emergency management processes, community emergency response teams, also known as CERT, simulation design, and emergency management in higher education. Thank you, Dr. Carr, for presenting our webinar today.
And thank you so mumuch, Kim, for the introduction. I have really enjoyed working with everybody here in Northwest Missouri. I'll talk a little bit about that as I go through. Just a little bit of background. Thank you so much for the introduction, Kim. This last year has been pretty busy for us in emergency and disaster management, as many of you guys can understand. One of the biggest things I've been working on this last year has been working with youth camps to include those in our area as well as nationwide. And so we've really tried to make sure that myself as well as our key stakeholders in this program are keeping a finger on the pulse of what's going on with COVID and with public health right now, and of course doing our best to communicate that to our communities. We're really thankful for this grant, and of course thank you to all of you for showing up this morning to participate in this. As we go through, Kim may have noted earlier, the slides for this presentation are going to be emailed out on Monday. So if I move a little bit too quick, don't worry, all of that will come on Monday. And then of course I've had plenty of time afterwards to make sure that we've got some question and answer time at the end of this presentation. A little bit of what we're going to be talking about today. First, I want to look at the conditions and the prediction for this summer based on emergency management and public health researchers. Next, I want to look at understanding risk and vulnerability. Those are two things that we study quite a bit in emergency management, and especially for those of you that are trying to make the big decision, if and when, what are we going to do, all those things. I think it's really important to understand how those factors play and give you some resources so you can make those decisions for your organization. I also have included a little bit of information about different types of events. Thank you to all of you that completed that pre-presentation survey. That really helped me adjust what exactly we have going on. So those of you that responded, I tried to make sure that your needs were addressed and some of those different pieces there. And then of course, at the end of this, we'll have that time for question and answer. Roughly, I'm anticipating this to be about an hour long, just to kind of manage your expectations. And then before I say anything more, I do want to say I have put this stuff together with the best of my ability and tried to make sure that we have the most current data, pulling information from the Nottoway County COVID dashboard and everything else just in the last couple of days. However, as you guys have observed, things can change very quickly. And so this information is our best estimate, meaning that there may be some potential for error. It's not a perfect prediction of where we're going to be, but it's the best estimate that we can offer at this moment with the information that we have. With the additional stuff that's getting sent out on Monday, you'll also receive a list of helpful links, and that will include the places where I got most of this information from. Just in case things change, you can go directly to the source and say, hey, Nottoway County, what are we looking at? And it'll spit you out those numbers that we need. So for starting off, we'll talk a little bit about, let's see. There we go. We'll talk a little bit about what's happening here in Nottoway County and what we can expect for current trends. So right now we're in a great spot. We're seeing a decreasing number of positive cases here in Nottoway County. We are also seeing an increase in vaccinations. Those of you that are following Nottoway County Public Health, as well as the other groups that are communicating about this, there are more and more opportunities for vaccines, and our state is starting to slate out when those additional tiers of access to those vaccines are going to happen. And then beyond that, there's some areas even outside of Nottoway County that have moved to saying, we're all open. Everybody in the state of Missouri, regardless of age, you can come down here and get the vaccine. And those are just too plentiful for us to cram into this one program. But that's a really good thing for us because it gives us an indicator that we're starting to get much more control over what's happening. Here in Nottoway County, we're seeing that, you can look at the screen here as kind of the line graph, but we're in the low 20s for number of positive cases that are in the community at one time. What we're anticipating as far as the community goes is that most organizations, including the university and other groups, are planning to go back to normal in the fall. And depending on the group, there may be some minor mitigation efforts in place, such as some groups may still require masks under specific conditions. However, most groups right now, they're looking at contingency planning because nobody necessarily wants to make broad statements just yet. So they're still trying to make sure that they're doing the best planning, but we don't want to give a definitive statement. Other trends to note here in Northwest Missouri, for the most part, you can see this chart. Most of the predictors that are out there have Northwest Missouri in a high risk or moderately high risk category right now. That's of the last week or so. And that number is based on total cases as well as the number of people that test positive. So, the more people that are coming in with testing, if we see that decrease in test positivity, that's going to decrease the risk level in those areas. Basically, those are the best predictors of that disease spread in the community. What we anticipate over the next few months is that we are going to continue to see an improvement on those things. So already we're down from extremely high risk in December to just high risk. So we're seeing that decrease somewhat. One other thing to note as we look at that, one challenging thing is that with the number of vaccines that are being distributed, that also leads to less anxiety among citizens, which also leads to less testing. In emergency management, we call that risk perception. If I perceive that there's less risk in the community, I'm less likely to think that my cold-like symptoms are COVID and just cold-like symptoms. So that could be a false predictor of that. But again, that's why we have a number of different predictions, such as the number of cases as well as test positivity. We also see that there is a potential for ripple effects from major metro areas. So if you guys watched the map of where cases were early on last year, what we saw is that the cases initially started in places like Kansas City, Omaha, Des Moines, and then we saw it slowly trickle back into more rural areas like where we are in Northwest Missouri. So we can kind of look at some of those areas, and if things are continuing on an upswing, we might want to watch that in case that ripples back out into the rural community like it did last year. One last thing that's kind of a hanging element and something that we're not really sure where it's going to go is that right now we're starting to see a greater documentation of COVID variants. that are popping up within the United States, specifically coming from other places. And right now they're doing their best to study that, but really all that's coming out is just the information that it's present. They're doing studies as to if those vaccines are effective against it, looking at where they came from, what type of variations they have compared to the initial strain, but make sure that we're tracking on that as we look at what's happening this summer. Right, so here is the best estimate for what we can expect for conditions this summer. These are based on the opinions of public health and emergency researchers across the country, and is my best effort to average out what people think. Obviously, there's some individuals that perceive a higher degree of risk, some that perceive the lower. What you're seeing here is kind of an averaging out of what those different opinions are. More than likely, what we're going to see is the middle column, where we are seeing conditions improve slightly, maybe moving from high risk to medium risk, and that depending on where you're at, it's advisable that mask and other mitigation measures continue. Not necessarily that they're mandated, we'll talk about that later, but that we recommend those for the sake of public health. Risk is decreasing, but we still want to make sure we're keeping our guard up and preventing that. Now, on either side of the spectrum, on the left side, we've got the idea that conditions improve drastically, that we whiz by medium risk and go straight to low risk to normal conditions. That's pretty unlikely, just because if we look at the idea of well, let's go back a couple slides. If you look at how long it took us to get down here, we're looking at a matter of 2 to 3 months that it just took to get from a high risk to a medium risk. And so we're not anticipating that we're going to have that much change that quickly. That would require a lot of mitigation efforts to follow through. That would require a lot of vaccinations, and simply things aren't happening quickly, not necessarily because of capacity, but because of participation for the most part. On the other end, there's the idea that conditions worsen. And so, it could be that a variant may not be susceptible to the vaccine. And so we've got something else to worry about. But once again, that is pretty unlikely at this point. Most of the public health research points to the idea that the vaccine is accounting for all of the variants that have been seen so far. But once again, this is an estimate. This is not a prediction. So I mentioned one of my biggest things that I've been working on over the last year is working with youth camps. And that includes here in the Midwest, as well as, as far as California, Maine, Alaska, and a couple other places. And one of the biggest questions we got from most of you on that pre-conference survey is, should I? Do you recommend? Those types of questions. What I'll tell you is, looking at my camps that I'm working with, most of you are familiar with what a summer camp is and how that operates. My general, elevator speech, if they call me up or shoot me an email, is I say, assume the conditions that you're experiencing right now are going to remain the same, even if mandates are expiring. So we've got a pretty big trend in the idea that, we're going to wipe out mask mandates. We're going to, loosen up on social distancing. We've already seen that to some degree in some businesses, et cetera. But for my camps, I'm saying, that's probably not a good idea. The risk is still there. It's just the risk perception that's going away. We're less worried about it. We're not any less physically susceptible to that virus. Next thing is, I recommend that they continue with their mitigation efforts through the summer. Again, we may see some positive change, but I recommend doing that just as a safety measure. And we'll talk about why that is as we go through. And then, of course, the last one, I strongly recommend revising programming that maintains the presence of that programming, but it minimizes any of the exposure or other things. I fully recognize that for many of you, you're looking at, how do we make sure and keep our place in the community, that we're helping the people that we're supposed to help, or we're providing the care that we're supposed to provide? How do we do that under these conditions? I am in no different situation with my role at the university. We are actively making the same decisions that you are related to our exercise that's happening this fall. Usually we have around 400 or 500 people out at Mazingo for exercise. We're having to sit down now and saying, how can we do this? Because I want to make sure my students are getting the right experience and that our program is able to maintain our brand, if you will. But I want to make sure that we're doing it under very, very safe conditions. And so all the thought processes that I'm going through, I'm going to try and share with you today as far as what process we're carrying through here. So let's talk a little bit about risk and vulnerability. These are really, really important terms for us to understand as you look to your decision-making processes. So to start things off, the idea of vulnerability is essentially the potential for loss. If you have money, you're vulnerable because something can happen to take that money away. If you are a healthy person, you have vulnerability in that something like COVID could take some of that health away from you. If you have physical property, if you have a brand that has value behind the brand, such as many of you, even though they may be nonprofits, there's still a degree of value in the community of being a responsible, reputable organization. And that's something that is vulnerable. You know, a negative event could take that away from us. So all of those different types of resources, we are vulnerable because we have the potential to lose those things. Now, risk is the idea of our vulnerability multiplied by whatever the threat or likelihood would be. So if we're looking as our two examples down here, we look at the idea of what's generally considered to be a low risk activity, such as bike riding in the outdoors. So if we had something like Bike Across America, like what happened a few years back here, or Bike Across Missouri, pardon me, that's a pretty low vulnerability situation. We've got social distancing, we've got outdoors, we've got additional mitigation measures where we can space out whenever we get to those event spaces. So overall, it's a low vulnerability situation. At the same time, we look at likelihood, and the possibility of COVID occurring at this type of event is relatively low. We've got all these controls for it. We put on additional controls through mitigation efforts. So low likelihood times low vulnerability equals low risk. It's still possible, but it's lower. Now, on the other end of the spectrum would be something like a mission trip to Alabama in a church van. Not just with youth, but with youth and adults and maybe some senior citizens. The likelihood of transmission in a closed van on a 16+ hour trip to Alabama is pretty likely. That's got a high likelihood attached to it. At the same time, with our vulnerability, it depends on the individuals that are in that van. If we have youth, they may get sick, but they may not get hurt if we're painting with a very, very broad brush. With senior citizens, though, as we've seen, they have more intense reactions a lot of times than youth do. And so we categorize that vulnerability as moderate. So high times moderate equals moderate to high risk. Again, this is something that is not an exact science, but it's something that for your team, as you're looking to make this decision, this gives you a bit of a metric to sit here and debate this stuff. What I typically recommend with most of my camps that I work with, or most of my local businesses, is to sit down and for you and your team to develop your list of what can possibly happen, and basically identify courses of action, which we'll talk about here in a little bit. And for each of you to develop the degree of risk off to the side for each of those courses of action. Let's say you've got 5 individuals. As each of you total these up as you go through, what's going to happen is that you may have different opinions. And what that means is that each of you is valuing different things in that equation. And then the discussion that takes place afterwards is going to inform your process much more than any one of you working on this alone. You're going to see things that you didn't see. You're going to learn things you weren't aware of about your organization. Most of you, like myself, are operating on a shoestring budget with your events this summer. You have individuals that you have picked to lead different sections of that operation because they're experts. Maybe you've got somebody that works with the kids, somebody that works with the logistics, somebody that works with the money. Each of them has different opinions. Doing this process of identifying risk as a group is going to leverage all of those different opinions, and it's going to make your decision much more informed, not necessarily easier, but at least you've got all of that information supporting that. Right, let's see. So one thing, I think that most of you are pretty familiar with this at this point, but just to include this to go over things, Some things related to risk of COVID. First of all, looking at indoor versus outdoor. Indoor, we really have a limited circulation of air. Our air handling systems are not designed to be a sterile space like a research lab of a hospital or something like that. And so outdoor events are typically advisable. We also look at the age and the health of participants. The younger and the healthier they are, the less susceptible to the negative effects of COVID that they are. There's still some degree of risk, but the less susceptible they are. As you go to the opposite end of the spectrum to older individuals with pre-existing conditions, that increases risk. We also look at space and degree of contact. So if we've got 6 feet of space, that's good. If we've got 10 feet of space, that's even better. Also looking at the duration of contact. So if you're offering a 1-hour training, say we were offering this webinar in person, that is less of a risk versus a full weekend retreat, like a leadership retreat that we might offer or something like that, just because you've got that longer term for individuals to breathe out those, breathe out their breath and those remnants of COVID into the air. And so that's just a bigger threat there. Last one is what mitigation efforts you have in play at your event. Specifically things like mask, barriers such as any of the plexiglass, and then of course things like hand washing, hand sanitizing, etc. All of these are things that you need to consider as you look at your course of action. For some of you, it's not possible to do things that are outdoors. If you are offering a computer science camp, that's going to be pretty difficult to move a computer science camp outdoors and have all the infrastructure available. So as we go through, we'll talk a little bit more about these. Additional factors that we cannot control. Number one is looking at the cases and conditions in our local area. We are really at their whim. We have to observe those, and there's not exactly a lot we can do as individuals to fight back against that, to stop it, to mitigate it. Next, individuals taking appropriate action if they experience symptoms. So with summer camps, we see this specifically with kids that don't want to miss out on a summer camp experience. Contrary to not wanting to go to school, for summer camp, a lot of them are willing to, fake not having a fever or not being sick in order to make sure that they go out to that camp. And so we have a tough time being able to control that. The only thing that we can do is, ask those questions, ask for the parents to help us in that process. And that's about the end of the line for us. Lastly, we really have no control over the actions of local, state, and national officials. The citizens of Maryville can speak up as they see fit. The city council will vote as they want to. The state, the governor will act as he wants to. Nationwide, the president will act as he wants to. And again, we just kind of have to go along with that. We also are not able to control the decisions related to mask mandates and other things. And so all we can do is really predict when those things are going to happen. And largely that's just observing what's going on in those discussions, such as city council here in Maryville. So another big question that a lot of you ask is, what is safe enough, or should we have this type of event this summer? That is impossible for me to answer with a definitive yes or no, because I simply don't know the inner workings of each of your events. Only you know about how you offer a concert, or how you offer a youth camp, or vacation Bible school, or whatever it is that you are operating. What my goal is to lay out how I make these decisions for the groups that I work with individually, and then let you ask questions to clarify how exactly you can do that for your camp, or pardon me, for your event. We already talked about the risk factors. We look at our short-term revenue losses as far as, can our nonprofit or our organization last until next summer without this revenue? Are we able to address our revenue needs through our savings or through donations or whatever else it might be? We also look at the reputation and long-term revenue. So one of the things I point out, especially with the camps that are much more revenue driven than some of your events that maybe already has a space that's provided for free, or maybe you're using other community resources. For a lot of these businesses, camps, and events that are revenue dependent, 25% of an organization's value is wrapped up in its reputation alone. not in its physical assets or its savings, but the idea of, something like a lot of people in Northwest Missouri have their favorite type of vehicle, and they have strong opinions about that type of vehicle. Well, if something happens, like with what happened with Toyota and the airbags for those vehicles, the value of that organization goes down because of the negative impacts of their reputation. So I want to encourage you guys to think about that as you make decisions. Just because, if you have an event and something bad happens and that impacts your reputation, how is that going to affect you guys in the long term? And let that guide you as far as, what things do we need to put in place to prevent that bad thing from happening. And then last one, again, I mentioned this with the computer camp, but the ability to alter programming. Some of you, this is a little bit easier to do than others. And so that's just something to take into consideration. If we are a computer camp, we can't exactly change where we're at or the fact that we need a ton of electricity for a power supply. And so we need to use that as some of our set conditions. That way we can adjust for all the other things we're looking at. The bottom line with all of this is that there is no zero risk scenarios this summer other than the idea of just simply not having our event. And I'll talk about why that's a little bit more challenging. But we look at the different events that you guys are looking at, and there's a spectrum of things that are low risk and things that are very high risk. And we need to look at where you guys are at on this spectrum and if you can reduce that risk at all and what that entails. And that's really what the rest of this presentation is going to be focused on. Here's our courses of action. This is not an exhaustive list. This is the starting point for many of you. And we'll go through these one by one, but this really gives you at least 4 directions to take, and then you can add your own personal variation on it, depending on what your capacities are, what your resource limitations are, what your programming limitations are, etc. So option 1 is simply postponing the event. I would bet that just about all of you did this last summer, and you're not ready to do this yet this summer. I fully recognize that. Again, I'm making the same decisions that all of you are, and we're having a tough time with it. We're having to look at all the stuff we're looking at today. So I understand that this is not ideal. For many of you, the big thing is that it loses loyalty. If you've got either parents that are bringing their kids or families that are coming to your event, or you've got donors that are contributing to your efforts so that it reduces costs for some of those individuals, not having this a second year may mean that those individuals start wondering, well, I've got this money to donate, or families are saying, I've got this time that I want to spend with my kids. Should I go and take this to some other place? If there's another event happening, I'm going to go to that instead. We had this with camps last summer where we looked at, Missouri and Kansas, those youth groups that are sitting on that state line. If one state opens and another state doesn't, then they're going to go to the ones that are open. So I fully recognize that. Really, the groups that I would recommend this for are those organizations or events where programming cannot be altered to fit the format to lower risk. So if you have something like a wrestling camp, that might be something that is a relatively high risk. And so that may be something we look at. Maybe we should, maybe we shouldn't. But again, that's up to the organization to decide. Option 2, online programming with in-person add-ins. So this is something that one of my big research areas right now is looking at New Orleans and the long-term recovery following Katrina, as well as the other hurricanes that have battered that area over the last 15 years. New Orleans specifically is a music-based city, as many of you know, and their music community was really hurting early on until they started looking at how they could adjust programming to fit the needs and, of course, the comfort of the patrons. Even if they were to open up some of these concerts, some of those individuals may or may not have been comfortable with attending those things. With what we've got with this model, so you move the music to the music performance to an online format using something like YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, etc. And then you offer tickets either for free with donation or minimum donation of X amount or higher. And what we see is that donation quality typically leads to even higher ticket prices. Those individuals that can't afford the ticket, I know for myself personally, I'm lucky enough that I was able to keep my job. And so for those individuals that job is coming into question, I'm doing my best to make sure that I'm investing in that. With the youth programming in our area, with some of the nonprofits in our area, I'm trying to make sure that if there's an opportunity to give a more generous donation than usual, I'm trying to do that. And I would bet most of your patrons that are really loyal to your organization are probably going to have the same thought process behind this. Some other things that we can look at with this, an important note on logistics. We want to make sure that we're comfortable with the technology that we're using. If you haven't used YouTube, Facebook, Instagram Live, we want to make sure we're practicing through that and doing a couple of tech rehearsals. For this presentation alone, since we, pardon me folks, my computer just gave me a notification that it's running low. All right. So for our tech rehearsal today, we met a half an hour beforehand. We made sure that I could share my slides. I made sure that my microphone and camera were working. And then depending on how many moving parts and pieces you may have, you want to make sure we're walking through those. If we've got a bigger event, such as an online choir concert, and we've got 8 microphones that are spread out throughout the auditorium, we want to make sure that we're hearing 8 of those. We want to make sure that we've got our sound levels at the appropriate level. And we want to make sure that lighting is correct so we don't look like zombies up on stage. There's all these different things we want to make sure that we work through. Some other examples of how we can do the add-ons portion of this. I think most of us at this point are familiar with the online programming and how that works, at least as observers rather than hosts. But other things that we can do as the add-ons portion of this would be looking at a dinner and a concert. This is one thing that happened, especially in areas where you've got a high degree of local restaurants, as well as some of these arts that are coming in. And so we're looking at something where the concert itself pairs with a local restaurant to offer a dinner in the box. This could be pre-prepared. It could be where you just throw it in the oven and cook it for 30 minutes. It could be where it's all the ingredients. All of those things are still providing revenue to that local restaurant that they may not have received early on, but it's also an opportunity for you to offer what we refer to as a white glove experience, or something where it is something beyond the basic, average thing. It's something, hey, this is neat. This is something that I can participate in. Similarly, with looking at kids' activities, kids are one of the biggest challenges that we had last summer, where they're out of school, they need stimulation, they need to continue their development intellectually, mentally, and so we want to make sure we're giving them an opportunity to engage. Maybe we're looking at something like Vacation Bible School and how we adjust that. We've got our online programming either through Zoom or YouTube videos, but then everything that we would have provided that kid for art projects or for activities, if they're making popsicle puppets or something like that, we're going to put all of that in a box and basically distribute that curbside whenever parents are signing their kids up for those events. They can follow along at home, they can still do those things, and frankly, it's a good opportunity for the parents to engage as well. Last one is probably the simplest option, and that's just a basic watch party. This is something that we did with our EDM students early on in the spring. I recognize that, on one end, we needed to have some sort of engagement with our students to make sure that everybody was having a good time. At the same time, I want to make sure it's fun and that we're having an enjoyable experience. So what we did is we had a number of nights where we watched disaster movies, and then we had students that would tweet along with it using the social media platform Twitter. That may not be what most of your patrons are wanting to do. Maybe they're not comfortable with that. But something like Facebook, I think most populations, regardless of age or tech savvy, are pretty comfortable with. And so you could do a watch party for your choir, for your group, whatever that is, and then have engagement through social media. People can chat. You can do things like, what's your favorite memory of this event? Or, if it is my father-in-law is a music minister in Liberty, and he did a number of nights where they just did the hymnal sing-along. So anybody that wanted to do things, they sent a PDF of the hymnal, and he said, I'll play whatever song you want, and I'll sing along with it. You can sing along at home. That was a really great opportunity. They had a huge amount of engagement, especially from those folks that are the regular churchgoers. So that's probably the easiest format that we could see there. All right, option 3 is looking at in-person altered programming. This is probably what most of you had in your mind before you started this presentation with me today. And frankly, there's a lot of ways that you can make sure that this is relatively low risk while still keeping that presence as a brand or a community organization here in Northwest Missouri. So if we look at this, there's multiple ways you can alter programming. Really what our desired effect is that we reduce the amount of possible contacts between individuals. If we reduce the amount of possible contacts, if and when somebody does test positive, that means we've got less individuals that we need to worry about getting sick afterwards. So one option is to look at less people over more time. So if I've got something like the picture here is a nature hike out in the woods, instead of doing one nature hike with 40 people, we do 4 nature hikes with 10 people each. That way we've been able to distance things out. Also similar to what schools are doing right now. If you're following along at home, you can look up the cohort model, which basically means that you silo groups to separate them. And that way, if somebody gets sick in one group, the other 2 groups that are there that haven't been exposed don't have to worry about quarantining or anything like that. We also look at, if we've got an event, one thing that most of the major businesses like museums or IKEA in Kansas City, they're regulating how many people are going into their space. So, they've got all of their decals set out on the floor, but they know that at any given moment, on average, there's 50% capacity of their store. And they just have their little clicker at the door as people walk in, and they make sure they don't have that much. You can do that either by that model of making sure that people are not just randomly showing up. The reality is that that's kind of difficult to do with most of the spaces that you're going to be hosting events in. And so instead, you could do things like regulating the tickets. If you've got something like a music concert or a theater production, you can sit here and say, we're just going to do multiple productions and we're going to decrease the amount of people in the auditorium each time. And then last one, change of space to minimize exposure, change from an indoor concert to one of the amphitheaters in town, things like that. And then one thing that most groups are at a bare minimum doing is, maintaining our in-person presence with additional mitigation measures in place. Mask and social distancing standards. We want to make sure that we have adequate cleaning procedures and supplies. I know both of those things because it's easy to say, I know how to spray down a building. I know how to spray down the facilities that are inside here. It's another thing to say, I have enough supplies to do this many times throughout that. One critical thing to do as you're looking at what mitigation measures you're going to have with your event is to communicate those early on to make sure that you've managed expectations. We'll talk about that more in another slide here in a second. We also want to make sure that we've got our event signage, we've got our communication of what we're doing, and then of course that we're enforcing whatever things that we are encouraging individuals to do. All right, so now we're looking at best practices for different types of events. And I did my best with most of you. We kind of had a separation of 3 big groups, and anybody that didn't fall into these, if you have specific questions, I'll stick around afterwards and I can answer those for you. But we saw youth events were a big group, music venues and concerts, and then we've got large community events, both indoor and outdoor. So walk through each of these and kind of give my best recommendations on what we should do there. So with youth events, one positive thing is that most of these students, regardless of age, have been following most of these as they go through. Either their classrooms are structured differently or their playtime is structured differently. It's not ideal for their development, obviously. As a new parent myself, that's something that I wish we could change, but it's like we've only got a couple months left until things are in a much safer place. The good things here are that, depending on the age, some are more comfortable with these masks than others. If you get up into middle school age, they're requiring this at the middle school in Maryville. Some of the other middle schools in the region are as well. We also look at the comfort with technology. More and more, we're seeing that younger kids are more and more comfortable with technology, either playing with mom and dad's iPhone or their smartphone, tablet, whatever that is. But we're seeing that more of those are getting comfortable at a younger age. I had a really funny question from a camp director that was doing a day camp for young kids, and he says, I'm trying to make this camp work, and this is for last summer. He's like, I'm trying to make this camp work. How do I get kindergartners to follow social distancing? I said, as the wife of the husband of a teacher, if you find that answer, please let me know, because I'd love to share that with my wife. We're still working on it with her after 6 years of working in education. Some key actions for those of you to communicate would be looking at communicating with parents. One option that can really help you gauge what your best decisions are for the summer is to look at what your parents prefer. If you've got parents that are saying, I'm really not worried about it. My kids have been exposed. Maybe they've been sick. I'm not too worried about it this summer. If you see that's a big trend with most of your parents, then maybe that is an important thing to include in your planning process. That doesn't change your concerns as an organization, but it certainly changes your perception of, what will my patrons think? What will my participants think? That can help you make those decisions there. Also communicating outwardly, this is our approach. This is what we're anticipating. That way it doesn't catch them off guard. I think early on, February, March, a lot of people were surprised whenever they showed up on the first couple of weeks of mask mandates being there. People saying, whoa, excuse me, I need to check your temperature before you enter the hospital, or I need you to wear a mask before you go into the supermarket. The last thing we want is for people to not anticipate that we're going to do some of these things and then show up and have to have words of, hey, why is this in place? Or trying to pull that person off to the side and explain why we're doing that approach. The other thing is to look at planning early for necessary resources. If you're thinking about changing your event space, now is probably the time to start making those plans and communicating with possible venues. Also looking at cleaning supplies. How much do those cost? Are we including that in our budget? Do we need to request additional resources from our donors to make sure that we are able to meet the mission under safe conditions? And then the last one that I'd recommend is, for many of you, you're offering one, maybe two standalone programs during the summertime. It may be that if you partner with a similarly oriented organization or event, that you can kill two birds with one stone. I buy these signage elements for me, but we make them broad enough to where the other 4 organizations I work with, they can use them for their events as well. Or talking to the venue and saying, hey, do you have signs available? Can we partner on this? That way you can use it for other spaces. Some of you may have an event that you're planning at Northwest. We've got all of the stuff already in place as far as signage goes. We've got signs on the door, signs in the hallways, one-way walking signs in different places. So that's a positive thing there. All right, switching to looking at music venues. This is broadly defined, not just to like a concert or theater, but also to something like jazz night at the pub or smaller venues like that. This kind of varies depending on the program that you've got. If we're looking at COVID-19 risk, for choirs, there's a moderate to significant risk of spread. What I'd encourage you to do, for those of you that are in this category, and the helpful links that'll be sent out on Monday, there are some links to studies that model they use similar mapping to what they use for hazardous material spills. They map, if you have 6 singers that are in a room, what does that plume mapping look like if that person does not have a mask on? Then also, what happens if you've got that person in a mask in that room? And it shows you colored plume mapping of what you can anticipate just in a regular space. Obviously, this isn't going to be for a giant concert space like maybe you're looking at, but it's just another indicator. Brass and woodwind instruments, those vary again by type, and that report also has those in there. It shows you the difference between a tuba and a flute and a saxophone and some of those other instruments. With a smaller ensemble, if you're talking about a trio, a quintet, something like that, there's just too many factors to accurately predict. If all of the musicians are singing, if it's just a instrumental brass ensemble, it's really too difficult. But again, I'd recommend looking at that modeling, and that'll give you some indicator. Obviously, our biggest push for music venues is to push things outdoors to the best of our ability. Maybe this is outdoor seating with distance, as is shown here. A lot of groups are moving to this model where we, just give people their own space. And then as you can see, if I needed to go back to the concession stand, or if I needed to go to the restroom, if I walk through these aisles in the grass there's enough room that I'm not going to get in somebody's space, and it's not going to be a concern. So that's an ideal thing, and that's relatively low price. You're talking about, a couple cans of spray paint, and then a bigger venue working with like the amphitheater at Donaldson Park, something like that. If we're looking at how we adjust to branding, one thing that I've recommended for most of the camps is looking at the white glove experience. Again, giving a more individualized and focused level of care to the individuals that are coming to that event. I had a camp that I worked with that typically they offer international study opportunities where they go, they probably were running 40 or 50 international study programs. All of those got shot down for an entire year. They lost a lot of their revenue, and I helped them reconfigure their model to be focused domestically. And that was one of the biggest things that helped them maintain revenue was, basically switching our wording to parents from, you're going to get so many experiences outside this country, so many different meeting, people, awesome experiences. We altered that and pivoted to the idea of, we are going to focus on you individually. We're going to make sure that you have a positive experience, that everything is going to go swell for your student. Similarly with this, maybe this is an opportunity to bring in additional vendors. Treat this kind of like a movie and a dinner experience that you might have at Alamo Drafthouse in Kansas City, or some of those higher end AMC theaters. Maybe we create an opportunity to partner with high school groups, to partner with FFA, FBLA, FCCLA, and have this be something where we engage those groups and say, we're looking to make this more of an engaging experience. Would your group be interested in doing the fundraiser you usually do at the Nottoway County Fair, but doing it here for the 200, 300 people that show up? We're going to compensate you this much out of this budget, so we know that it's going to be a net gain for you, but also this will be a good opportunity to get out in the community. Additional features like that are going to maintain that loyalty, and it's going to be a bigger event for recruitment, or pardon me, it's going to be a bigger thing for getting people to sign up for that event, because they know that it's not just the average experience where we're further away from people. It's the experience in a different format that's going to be a more enjoyable experience than we've got in the back of our brain. Again, communications are going to be critical in telling people, how this is going to go. I don't want to find out the day of, whenever I'm showing up, that my little foursome of seats is all the way back at the back of the stadium. I want to know how you're seating, what you're doing for seating. I want to make sure that I understand what your processes are going to be once I show up. Share that stuff with me early on so my expectations are managed. Right, large community events. In general, this is just anything past 100 people. What I would say is that there's just too many predictors in this. I would recommend weighing the costs and the benefits. Again, many of you, if you're talking about big events, this is a revenue generating thing, both for you or maybe some of your partner organizations, if you're a county fair or Rust Under the Stars or some of those other events. And I don't want to be the person to tell you, no, this is unsafe, you shouldn't do this summer. The reality is it varies by group, and there's all kinds of different things you can make this an event where it has a substantially lowered risk. But it's up to you to kind of work through what we've talked about today, and figure out the best way to approach that while still meeting your mission and your, maintaining your brand presence as a business or organization. So the question that you have to ask as you've slated out your your approach is, have we minimized all risks and have we maximized benefits? If there's anything that we can do to minimize risk without, taking a significant toll to our organization, we want to do this. By all measures and by all estimations, this is probably the last summer that you're going to have to do this thing. If this summer you break even versus, make a sizable profit compared to what you've done in previous years, if there was ever a time for it, it's now. And we'll talk about the brand stuff again. Keep in mind, 25% of your organization's value is wrapped up in your reputation alone. If your reputation takes a hit this summer because you had one of these big events, you went against recommendations, and you just decided to open things up without any mitigation stuff in place, it may be that next summer you see a substantial decrease in the number of people that are attending your event. Or if you're one that's bringing in other vendors and other businesses, maybe they choose to go to a different event instead of yours because of the negative experience they had. Keep those in mind as we're making those decisions. Again, similar to some of the other ones we've talked about, make sure that you have adequate cleaning supplies and processes. Make sure that we both have the stuff to do it as well as the expertise to do it well. If necessary, make sure that we're looking at our staff training. If you've got volunteers, make sure that we're spending some time saying this is how we're going to approach this. Or if you're putting a mask mandate in for your organization, to say in order to participate in our concert series, we ask that every individual, as they're entering and until they take their seats in their designed area, we ask you to make sure that you're wearing a mask. If you're asking for that, make sure that you're talking to your staff about how to communicate that, as well as how to communicate with individuals that do not want to do that. We want to make sure that we're not leaving them high and dry, because again, they're volunteers. They're not getting paid to be there. And last one, what additional resources do we need to ensure this flows like we want it to? If you come onto Northwest Campus, what you'll see is that any of our high traffic spaces have adjustments made. So there's stop signs on exit doors whenever you're coming in. That way you go through the entrance door. There are flow rooms where, like, I'm sitting in a big classroom right now, there's an indoor and there's an outdoor. Some of these things make it much easier to manage some of that process. And it'll be both an effective measure, as well as the patrons that are coming will see that you're taking those things seriously, and that will add to the legitimacy of your event this summer. Overall, if you're looking at best practices, I've done my homework to the best ability that I can and provided some professional organizations in the handout that you'll be sent on Monday. Look through those. There's a lot related to different youth programming, musical events, etc., and hopefully that gives some guidance. The reality is there may be some of you in this call right now that have a program that is so unique that there's not really a professional organization that matches what you do, or maybe I did not predict that and didn't find that for you. If you just search for professional organizations, you'll be able to find quite a bit of free information out there. Whenever I was working with camps last summer, we've got everything from canoeing to small sailboating to climbing wall to paintball to other things. And each one of those, I was able to find a professional organization either in the United States or in Canada or in Australia that communicates, these are the best practices that we've identified. And frankly, their knowledge of that niche area of interest that you may have is going to be much more than what I can offer. I've got best practices at a broad level, but they're really getting down to the nitty-gritty of things that you might be interested in. Other things that you might use as your strategy would be finding organizations that are bigger than yours in places like Kansas City or Omaha, Des Moines, etc., and look at how they manage. Also with Eventbrite, the group that you signed up with for this session, they actually have a whole handbook, and the link to that is in that handout as well. And then of course you can just Google whatever your event is, Maryville Young Players or youth theater activities, COVID best practices, and it's going to come up with some professional organization recommendations as well. All right, I've touched on this a couple times, but make sure we're communicating early to manage expectations. To further delve into that, This has to do with our social media as well as our event registration. If you look at what Northwest did, again, most of you probably follow what's going on at Northwest just because of your proximity to the university. They started in about May to June communicating the way that they were going to approach reopening in the fall, what they expected for individuals to have ready to go, making sure that they were communicating to patrons that it was going to be a safe environment, et cetera. And they were doing that to make sure not only that they were letting people know, but to get people in the mindset of this is what the experience is going to be whenever I show up. That way there was, less conflict whenever people showed up, because they weren't surprised. They knew exactly what they were going to experience before they even showed up on site. Same thing with your organizations. We want to take every opportunity to do that. Next, whatever rules that you set, we want to make sure that you are enforcing them. Meaning, if you've got a mask requirement for your event, make sure that we are getting our volunteers bought into that, and that they are going to help you enforce those rules. If not, that's going to be a reputational issue where, well, you set this, but then you didn't enforce it. Social media is a place where, bad gas travels fast. People can see that on social media. You may get criticism there. It's just easier that if you set those rules, make sure that you're enforcing them. Last thing, we want to make sure that we are communicating with our staff and volunteers. That way we maintain what we refer to in emergency management as a common operating picture. Meaning, for our presentation today, the team that put this thing together with the Regional Council of Governments, which is an exceptional group. Thank you guys for doing what you do. We communicated 5 or 6 times about what today was going to look like, how we were going to communicate with you, what approaches we were going to take if people had questions or if they wanted to know further information. And we knew what to expect before this thing even started. Make sure that your group is on board with that and that you have provided all the information necessary, again, so that there's not surprises at the last moment. We want to make sure that you're also test driving your plan as you develop that. Practice with your technology. One thing that I like to do is I like to have some of my students, whenever I do like our disaster movie night, like I mentioned earlier, before I did that at a broad level, I had my group of ringers that I know that these 8 or 9 students are aces, that they're going to do a great job, that they're going to help me and give me good information and feedback. I took those through the process. We watched a sample movie and we asked for feedback, and they helped me refine that model to make sure that it was the best possible whenever we rolled it out to the group. If you've got a few individuals, maybe we're doing that choir event, we want to practice through with bringing people into the auditorium and showing what exactly the process is. You don't necessarily need to bring in a group of 10 or 15 people, but physically walk through that process and make sure that you're thinking about things as you go through. And of course, ask for feedback and be sincere about that. I think one thing we do a lot of times with our Midwestern niceties is say, any feedback that you can provide, I'd appreciate it. But then a lot of times our people know this, like, well, I don't want to be too harsh. Now is the time to have a thick skin and say, no, be brutally honest with me. Tell me if this is going to work. We want to have a healthy degree of skepticism, because if we were not hard on ourselves early on, that means that there's the opportunity for somebody else to be hard on us later. All right, so we've talked about risk, we've talked about different approaches, we've talked about the courses of action that we might take, and we've talked about the individual types of events that are represented on the call. The last thing I want to talk to you guys about is making the final decision and how we go about that. I know that this is probably about the phase that many of you are at. We're entering the middle of March, which is about the last possible moment to make some of these adjustments before we start marketing for our events this summer. And so I want to talk you through what I am doing with my group right now for our Missouri Hope exercise. Again, we typically have around 500 individuals that come out in October, and they're from across the country. They're from Oklahoma, Florida, New York, Maine, and a couple other groups. We're having to make these decisions, and in addition to the risk management that we talked about earlier in the presentation, we're also going through this piece here, which is related to both reputational risk of, how are we going to make sure that our organization still looks good? But the reality is, if we manage the human element of making sure that we've done the most that we can to minimize risk and maximize benefit, the reputational stuff is kind of an afterthought. If we're doing our best to make sure that we're minimizing risk, that's going to help everything else. So here's how we're making this final decision. So we're going to discuss risk. As we've mentioned, we're going to use that risk equation of likelihood times vulnerability equals our risk. We're going to talk through that. We're going to sit down with our major stakeholders and ask them what their opinions are. Next, we're going to look at the idea of potential negative outcomes. And what I typically do with this is known as hindcasting. And what hindcasting is it is a discussion simulation focused on the potential negative outcome of current circumstances. So basically, we give a fictional news story about an event that's presented to our planning team, and we're asked to respond to how that would go. To provide you an example, here's one that I worked with in our camp, and I've changed up a little bit of information to relate to this. Pretend that this is coming out in the Northwest Missourian here in the middle of June. Maryville Paint Slingers Art Camp abruptly notified parents on Wednesday that the camp had been halted due to a potential COVID-19 exposure at the camp. Event host John Doe said in an email, "One of our facilitators had tested positive for the virus. We are taking all necessary steps to minimize further exposure, including the cancellation of our event." The event's now deleted Facebook event page said that masks were not required at the event, but that additional safety measures were being taken. Photos of the first 2 days of the event show the facilitators not wearing masks. Parents criticized the event on social media with little response other than noting that refund processes were in the works. It is anticipated that 40 area youth and 10 adult facilitators were affected by this exposure. Now, I would like to think that the Northwest Missourian would not be this harsh on an organization if something happened, but it could be that this news comes out on the Northwest Missourian. It could be that parents publish this stuff. I think we've seen quite a few examples of parents or community members, not necessarily in Maryville, but nationwide, that are saying, I went to this facility and the following thing happened to me. And then it's shared thousands of times nationwide and it becomes a national issue. Again, I don't think that would be the case here in Maryville, but it may be enough that community members are aware and that impacts our reputation. So as we look to that case study, for you as a director or planner, write up whatever thing that is similar to that, but do that as it relates to your event. If it's a choir concert, change those factors to say that, one of the singers in the group was a positive case, and now we're worried about the other singers in the group that may be senior citizens. If it is a Maryville Young Players type of thing, one kid was a positive test, it was a positive case, and so now we've got the following individuals that are exposed. Write those out and then provide that to your team. The way that we process it from there is we ask what happened, and we ask all of the individuals at the table. So all of our counselors or adult volunteers or whoever those are, if I'm the planner, what happened at our event? And kind of sit back and be quiet and see what their responses are. Well, if we're talking about, I'll talk about Missouri Hope. If we're talking about Missouri Hope, well, we typically have a really strong, friendship kind of relationship with all the students. And so maybe it's that they followed all the precautions whenever we told them to, but then whenever they were behind scenes doing things like eating meals or social time, maybe they didn't follow those requirements as closely. Okay, well, what else? Well, maybe we didn't include, a regular cleaning of the bathrooms that, we did what we usually do, which is clean them every day, but maybe we need to clean them in shifts to make sure that everybody's protected. Okay, well, we start getting into the what went wrong piece. Each one of those observations, I start noting that it's like, okay, well, if we're worried about social time for those folks, we need to make sure that we're watching that, or make sure that we, are trying to set things in place where we minimize the risk during that social time. okay, well, if we are looking at bathroom cleaning, maybe we need to make sure that we've got, at Northwest, we've got sprayers in each of the rooms. So maybe whenever we get done with our shower process, similar to folks that are spraying down your grout on your tile work in the bathroom, maybe we ask the participants to hose down the shower space so we know that we've minimized that risk. Now that we've got what we think might go wrong, we also look at the cause. And if what went wrong doesn't clearly identify that, we have a thing in emergency management called the game of the 5 whys. We simply ask why over and over again until we get to the root cause. The example I usually give is if my wife and I are in an argument and one of us can't figure out what's going on because it didn't seem like this was a relevant issue, we ask, okay, my wife will say, okay, why are you upset? Well, I had a rough day at work. Well, why did you have a rough day at work? Well, I got an email from this situation, blah, blah, blah. Okay, well, why did that bother you? Well, because there's really nothing that I can do about it. Oh, so really what you're frustrated about is that there's stuff going on and that you don't have control over it. Well, that's not something we can necessarily change, but that changes the tension from between my wife and I to, me angry at this other thing and my wife being supportive of me, or vice versa. Again, my wife's an educator an educator like myself, and she has similar situations to that. So with your stuff, with your event, we cross through that game of the 5 whys and say, okay, the kids were too close. Well, why is that? Well, we didn't make account for the following. Okay, well, let's try and make sure that that cause is addressed as we look through our plan. Next thing would be looking at, let's say that this event did happen. How would we respond? This is a good way to walk through our different courses of action. If you slate out, the different possible choices you can make with hosting your event, from no change whatsoever, we're going to do it like we did in 2019, to on the other end of the spectrum, we're going to cancel the event. And then in the middle, you've got all the different ways that you're going to adjust programming or adjust mitigation. Walk through each one of those things and walk through that bad thing happening of a positive COVID case and ask, if this happened, how would we respond and could we effectively respond? And then the last one, is this negative outcome avoidable? If not, is it worth it? If we're looking at something like a hands-on team-based event, there's not really a good way to ensure social distancing of a contact sport. So if that negative event does happen and we have a positive case, we can't really avoid that. And so the question we have to ask ourselves is that negative outcome worth it? Are we going to be able to recover? Is this going to be a significant thing for us to track on in the future? All right, some final notes on planning before we break for our question and answer time. The first one would be making sure that we plan for reality. I encourage all of my camp directors, any of my business leaders, community organizations, to have a healthy degree of skepticism about our efforts. I don't mean that you shouldn't be optimistic, but as one of my mentors has said, hope is neither a course of action nor strategy. We don't want to use that as our baseline. We want to make sure that we're remaining in objective fact and trying to control for all the variables that we can control. If we can't control for those, we need to be realistic about the possibility that they may come around to bite us in the butt. So maintain a healthy degree of skepticism about what's going on. We also want to make sure that we're planning for reality rather than ideal circumstances. The example that I give there is looking at kids. Kids are going to do what kids are going to do. If you want to know how kids have adjusted to some of the mitigation efforts the schools have put in place, talk to any teacher at any school that has those in place. My wife is, she's constantly working with kids about, make sure you're wearing your mask. Or we get a couple kids who are like, no, I'm not going to wear my mask because it's not. Those are things that are a reality if your organization is planning a youth event this summer. Make sure that we are using that as the reality versus the ideal circumstances that we're going to set these requirements, everybody's going to follow them, and we're going to have no conflict. One other thing that I would recommend in rare occasions is, depending on the type of event that you are doing and depending on the liability that you are accepting, you may want to talk with legal counsel if necessary. Whenever I'm working with some of my camps, for example, we're talking about week-long resident camps that have a much greater degree of risk versus a 1 hour on a Saturday morning farmer's market. We're talking about a large amount of youth that are in close proximity, sharing shared lodging, and are working with one another, to some degree hands-on throughout the week. That is a much greater degree of contact than a farmer's market. For some of them, they were looking at the idea of requiring temperature checks, possibly doing secondary physicals whenever their kids show up to that camp, doing daily health physical checks, having surveys. And those are additional processes that may need to be approved by your legal counsel. Again, I don't think you're going to do a temperature check whenever people show up to a concert or a farmer's market, but maybe you've got a different type of organization and maybe you feel like that is necessary. If you feel that that is necessary, check out with that person. Many of you have pro bono legal counsel. That's a adult advisor. Maybe they can help you out with that. I'd recommend it. Last one is to trust your gut. If you feel uncomfortable with the choice that your group is making, that's probably a good gut feeling to follow. If you feel like something bad may happen, follow up on that. We a lot of times try and push things off. We're like, oh no, I'm sure things will be okay, but we've got that grinding of gears in our stomach. Trust that. That probably means that either you've got additional work to do, or you may want to consider, redirecting where exactly your program is going for the summer. So the additional resources that we're going to be sending out, you're going to have a resource sheet that's coming via email. I would also encourage you to attend our upcoming business continuity session with the Northwest Missouri Regional Council of Governments. That's going to be a lot of the content that I could not squish into this 1 hour segment here. Whenever we look at business continuity, we're going to give a much greater conversation to the idea of risk, how we measure risk. There's also going to be a risk assessment tool that's included with that presentation so that you can get down to the nitty gritty of what that looks like. And you only have to wait a couple weeks for that presentation. So if you really liked what you saw today, both for myself as well as for the Regional Council of Governments, I'd request that you sign up for that webinar. There's going to be 2 different ones that are coming up in the next couple weeks, and I'll let Kim talk about those after we get done here. But I'd encourage you to do that. And of course, last but not least, as you guys are looking to your questions that you may have, if you're watching this as a recorded session, feel free to email me. Those of you that are still on the line, we're going to have more than enough time, and we've only got 15 people here today, so I'm sure that we can just talk through and have a discussion. And anybody else that's attending, maybe they can be informed by some of those questions as well. But please feel free to reach out to me by email. This summer is a little bit tough because we've got quite a few of our students that have already been placed for internships. But if you're looking for internships, either for this summer or next summer to do stuff like risk management planning, feel free to shoot me an email and I can see what we can do about getting you information. We've got probably another 10 to 15 students that may need internship placement this year or next summer. And so maybe we can help you out with those and get you some additional staff. And with that, I've got our time for our question and answer. So I guess we've got a small enough group here. If you do have questions, feel free to unmute yourself and just ask those questions. And again, hopefully some of these answers will help some of those other individuals that are planning their own events.
Thank you, Dr. Carr. Does anyone have any questions for him?
I don't know if I have a question per se, but I do have some comments. Very, very good information, but I think what we're struggling with in the county I work for is the difference in communities. So when we plan, we're planning an event now, let's say in Mound City, that's going to differ greatly from Oregon. And
right.
I guess my question is how do we try to include everyone because we'd like them to come, but still be able to set up the correct guidelines, because some communities are all about masks, all about those precautions. Other ones throw them to the wind and
Absolutely.
Don't care. So
for most of your events, if we're looking at the way to gauge exactly what you're talking about with regional variances, the starting place that I would go to would be drawing a circle on the map of where you typically see participants or attendees coming from. So if we're looking at a concert or a camp, oftentimes, you have some degree of awareness of where we're coming from. As you look to that geographic space, if you think that there's variance, I would immediately drop your risk analysis, if you want to call it that, and focus on the areas that are in the worst shape, for lack of a better term. So those areas that either have a higher rate of positive cases, or you see that there is a lower rate of mitigation efforts or whatever that is, and include that in your planning factors. We want to make sure that we are adjusting accordingly. And again, that may shape how you decide to do mitigation efforts for your event. With that set as our risk level, now how can we maintain what our desired effect is while taking account of those risks? So if you know that, let's say that, college campus, Northwest, we've had students and faculty and staff and any campus visitors that have been following mask mandates for the last year. Asking them to do that at a campus event is not going to change any perception on their part, because that's the status quo. That's what they're already doing. Now, if we switch that to saying we're going to have an event on campus and invite those other communities that haven't had that, that's probably where we sit here and say, do we need to change anything about our programming to include that? If people are showing up to Northwest campus, we've got mask mandates, we've got social distancing standards, we've got cleaning mandates. And so those things are already there. If we switch that to off campus, if I were to say, again, with Missouri Hope, I'd look at, do I need to keep those things in place? If so, can I guarantee the people are going to follow those? You do have the ability to say, we're asking people to have a mask whenever they come in, and then kind of lay out the ground rules of, this is what we expect. Please make sure that you're wearing your mask during the entire performance. If you do feel the need to take that off, just step outside, and communicate that very clearly. As long as you're being upfront about it, you're going to minimize any of that frustration that people may experience going through there. But again, I'd recommend that you make sure that you are enforcing those things. That way you don't create a double standard even within your own event. Yes, that is one of those challenging things where Northwest had to go through that same decision-making process of, we've got Maryville, but our students are coming from Omaha, Kansas City, and Des Moines. How do we include that? And it's kind of adjust to the least common denominator. Whatever you anticipate as the possibility for increasing risk, set that as the baseline for your risk measurement, and then adjust accordingly. Thank you very much, Marcus, for that question. Any other questions from the group? And you can also feel free to include those in the chat as well, if you aren't able to turn microphones on. Some other things that I'd add while people may be getting their questions in, there are a number of other free trainings that are available in different areas. You can take free contact tracing and other information for your organization through Johns Hopkins. They're pretty much the leader on a lot of the research efforts that are taking place with COVID right now. I'd also say that for event planning and other public health planning opportunities, FEMA has what they call their Emergency Management Institute, which is a lot of independent study courses. They are fairly rudimentary, as anybody will tell you that have taken those courses before. But as a starting place for individuals that are just wanting some awareness, there's some really great features in there talking about some of the things we've talked about today. Looking at risk, looking at event planning, public health, et cetera. And those may be helpful to many of your organizations.
Is there any other questions? Just feel free to unmute. and ask if you have any. All right. Well, while we're wrapping up our session, again, I just want to thank John Carr and Northwest Missouri State University for their partnership to create and deliver today's large event planning workshop. As he mentioned earlier, Mr. Carr will be presenting a business continuity workshop for us as part of our EDA CARES Act Recovery Grant. The first one of those workshops will be on Tuesday, March the 23rd at 5:30 in the evening. We will then have a repeat session offered on Tuesday, April 13th at 7:30 a.m. Flyers for that are actually in the chat, so please check that out. It is another free webinar that you can register for through Eventbrite. It also will be recorded, and very much like today's webinar, we will send out copies of the slides afterwards, as well as a post-webinar survey. A recording of today's webinar will be posted on the Regional Council's Facebook page, Northwest Missouri Regional Council of Governments, and on our website probably early next week. And before we finish up today, are there any further questions that anyone's thought of? Okay. Well, with that, I would like to thank all of you for attending on this, what is a sunny Saturday morning, and hope that you receive some great content for your future events. Please remember that you can reach out to John Carr if you have questions after our workshop today. And thank you for attending.
Thank you all.
Thanks.
Thank you, John.
Thank you. Thank you.